We came online February 2006. Judicial work started in July 2006 when I was sworn in my national colleague. And it is an internationalized board, a hybrid board, which means that it was formed after an agreement between the international community and the government of Cambodia, which means that all offices, judicial and administrative, have national and international staff with their respective jurisdictions and responsibilities. Which means that we have to apply Cambodian law and international law wherever applicable. And we have one of our probably most difficult tasks is to blend in those two and interpret them and apply them fairly. And it means that we are indeed located in situ. We are located where the crimes have happened, albeit 30 years ago. I remember the first day of hearing in Sierra Leone when, seeing the long line of people waiting to get in and to see justice being done, to hear the stories of people who had lived through the same thing as they did. It's quite an opportunity, and as I said, it's one of the reasons that I believe this model can work if it's possible. We are tasked to prosecute those responsible for the crimes committed during the period that became known as the Democratic Kampuchea period. We are tasked to prosecute the senior leaders and those most responsible. Those are the terms used. So an objective criteria, the senior leaders, and a more subjective one, those most responsible. We had in Sierra Leone, as Stephen mentioned, those who bear the greatest responsibility, which I think is probably a higher threshold than those most responsible. Obviously, the evidence determines who these guys are, first of all. You come in, you start understanding, you start looking at the evidence, and you start a running tab of who is on top and who gets down, who fits the bill and who doesn't, who you can prosecute and get convicted and who you cannot, despite your best intentions and belief. We are therefore bound by the time frame, which is 1975 to 1979. Some of you may be old enough to remember, or more than admit it, but in April 1975, a group that became known eventually as the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia. And for the next 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, proceeded to try and alter Cambodian society fundamentally along ideologically based lines. And to achieve that, or so we allege, the leaders of that movement agreed to persecute classes of Cambodian society that they deemed unfit for the future utopian Cambodia that they wanted to build. In the process, and at the conclusion of it, which ended when the Vietnamese army ousted the government and took over the country in 1979. In the process, 1.7 million people died, men, women, and children, in 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days. Some of whom died directly at the hands of the perpetrators. Some of whom died following or as victims of the policies of the regimes, which included mass deportation from the cities back to the countryside, which included forced labor on massive work projects or on meeting quotas for agrarian production that were unreachable, but people died in the process of proving that. Some of whom died of famine because of the lack of food brought about by these policies and also by the lack of proper medical care. The Khmer Rouge abolished every known right that you can think of, including the right to life, to have no legal obstacle, at least, to achieving those aims. When they were finally ousted in 1979, they still remained a force. They still remained actually an international player, the Khmer Rouge movement, and some countries supported their seat at the UN as representative of Cambodia for a few years. It is something that the court's officials often hear from the Cambodian people. And of course there's political reasons for that, and that's the reality of it. They were also a military force up until the late 1990s within Cambodia. when eventually the latest, the last remaining significant groups were brought in from the bush through, among other things, an amnesty for the members of the Khmer Rouge and a pardon for 2 of its leaders. The court came about through lengthy negotiations between the government of Cambodia and the international community, which revolved around sovereignty for the Cambodian government and for international standards of fair trial for the international community. And the product of those long and arduous negotiations is our court. We have, as a guarantee of international standard, the inclusion of international personnel and the obligation to apply international law, where national law is either in contradiction or silent as to some of those issues. We have jurisdiction over genocide, over crimes against humanity, over national crimes, war crimes, and a few others. It is based on the national system, a continental law system, which is in various modes or various interpretation applied throughout Europe. Right now, as I said, we started our work, our judicial work in July 2006. In July 2007, the co-prosecutors, sent the first case to the co-investigative judges. It included 25 crime sites, a series of criminal definitions, if you want, for those crime sites that included genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes. And it named 5 individuals as responsible. Those 5 individuals were arrested, and we asked for their detention, and were successful, as we were on appeal for 3 of those detentions. They include the alleged number 2 of the regime, brother number 2, an individual named Chea, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, who was tried in absentia along with Pol Pot in 1979, and who was subsequently given a pardon, and as I said, came in from the bush with his troops, and who has challenged his prosecution, actually, during his bail appeal, based on that form of conviction. It includes the Minister of Ieng Sari's wife, Ieng Petit, who was at the time the Minister of Social Affairs, and who played quite a significant role. It includes the former head of state of Democratic Kampuchea, Khieu Samphan, who is represented by a notorious, I think I can say notorious, French lawyer called Jacques Vergès, who was the subject of a documentary, The Devil's Advocate, that you might want to check out. And it also includes an individual nicknamed Doik, who was the head of a particularly notorious detention center, a place called Tuol Sleng, or better known as S21. A killing machine, a place where perceived opponents of the policies or the regimes were sent to be tortured, forced to confess to anything.